Yeah.
Now, looking at the cost of living adjustments that are coming, they will be final. It's usually like October,
Should be
10
October
to the
10th.
20th. Yeah, it's usually in that time frame. Jason, go ahead and talk about the cost of living adjustment, which are projections right now, but for the last,
Yeah.
as far as I can remember, projections have been very, very close,
Yeah.
especially when they're given in September. So what's
Right.
it looking
Right.
like for veterans right now?
Well, what's funny is, Clay, that you mentioned that, because you have the Senior Citizens League that tracks this stuff and does projections all the time. And they get pretty close, especially when they're a few months out, unlike the VA with their budget. So, which is funny that, wow, people can actually figure this stuff out. Anyway, so over the course of the last 8 months, we have seen a rise in the projections into a fall. And we have been falling the last few months magically during the time period that is calculated for COLA, right? So for those that don't know, COLA is calculated using the last quarter of the fiscal year, the federal fiscal year, or the third quarter of the calendar year, which is July, August, September. So now we've gotten 2 months in the bank as far as data, CPI data, CPI-W, specifically that subset of data is used to calculate COLA. We're now in halfway through September, so the data is already halfway done. You can't go back and change it unless you're the government for COLA calculations. But side note. So, but we're halfway through, jokes aside, we're halfway through September. And so we only got a couple more weeks, and then that data will be completed. And then in October, October 10th, the CPI-W data will come out, and Social Security will then calculate the full COLA. Right now, what we are anticipating as far as a projection or forecast is concerned is a 2.5%. So it's dropped from, I believe its high was in the low threes as far as projections. So we've dropped, a 0.5% or, maybe a 0.6, right? 5/8% or so. So we've dropped down, kind of substantially if you look at a percentage of that percentage, right? Which isn't good. This is what I've always say, Clay, and this is what rubs me kind of the wrong way. We can all agree that inflation overall does this, right? This is my fancy pop-up line of a graph. Okay, so there you go. And then that's inflation, right? Here's COLA. They're both trending upward, but there's a gap, and that gap just gets bigger and bigger over time. So you talk to somebody who's been receiving, or if you do receive Social Security and you've been receiving it for a substantial amount of time, 10, 15, 20 years or so, put something in the comments about how you've seen it just erode more and more and more over time. Because the spending power you had when you first started getting your Social Security 10, 15, 20 years ago is much different than it is today. I can guarantee it. So that's really bothersome. Now, there has been legislation, Clay, and I know you're aware of it, but I wanted to throw this out there and then see your thoughts on all of this. There has been legislation over the years that calls for a different indice within the CPI data, right? A different subset. And instead of using CPI-W, utilizing CPI-E. CPI-E is the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. And if you were to go back in time and take 20 years worth of adjustments, we would have realized on average a 0.25% or 25 basis point bump on every single year averaged out, right? One year might have been 3, the other might have been 1, right? So anyway, the average would have been a quarter per year. In adjustments. And the Senior Citizens League has been a champion for that. Again, there's been legislation that calls for that utilization, both on the House and the Senate side. There's some pieces of legislation that just say, change it. There's one, I think the guy's name is Gallego, out of Arizona, congressman, who put one out and said, let's use CPI-E. It's going to give seniors, and they're always focused on Social Security, but by default, it's veterans too, right? So it's going to put more money in the seniors' pockets, blah, 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 blah. And oh, by the way, people who are hesitant to utilize CPI-E say, well, it's not always higher. Sometimes it's the same or lower. And so he put a provision in there in his legislation that says utilize CPI-E unless CPI-W is higher. Then utilize CPI-W. Yay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So then what that would do is that would actually take your 20-year average and bump that up from that 0.25% or so and make that even a little bit higher. So, it doesn't sound like much, but when you take a quarter and then you add another quarter and you add another and you add another, you're compounding interest in a way, right? In a increase sort of a way. So it's actually a great thing. So I'd much rather get a 0.25% on a higher number than a 0.25% on a lower number, right? Do that year over year over year, and it actually is helpful. So anyway, I'm going to kick it back to you because I can keep talking on and on about this because I hate it so much. So back to you, Clay.
That's not my, area of expertise, if you will, especially when we talk about math. But I will say this:
Marine
I think
Corps.
it's going to be. I think it's math for Marines, right? Which I did complete for the record. But I think it's going to be difficult, and I'm not a political dude at all. However, I can tell you a lot of people, a lot of representatives in both areas are very focused on the deficit. And it's difficult because no party wants to take ownership of saying, hey, we're going to pay more. And that is a huge issue. That's way above my head. But that's my very first thought. It does suck to know that it is an increase, right? So for instance, I'm going to give you $2 extra, but you're going to give me $3. It's like, okay, well, are you really giving me $2 or am I just losing $1? That is the best way to explain cost of living and inflation, right? That's what happens.
That's awesome.
And so, you'll see, what is it, 37 right now for 100% VA disability. Although the number is more, it's actually your spending power is less than a few years ago. And so, yeah, we're getting an increase, but it's like, it's a backhanded increase, right? Anyways, that's cost of living in a nutshell, Jason. I'm glad you brought that up. And it really goes back to just politics, man, which honestly was not the plan for this episode, but it should be bipartisan. It's clearly not. I think veterans are used as pawns, as talking points, instead of saying, hey, we just had a 20+ year war somewhere, and that's just the last 20 years. That doesn't even include, right? Jason's era, your Shield Storm, your Panama veterans, your Vietnam era veterans. I mean, it's insane to me. Anyways, that's cost of living adjustment.